Good morning, Gideon. We are back to the Gemara. Kuf Tes Zayin Amud Beis 116b. Sorry, yeah, 116b. Right after the Kuf Tes Zayin Beis, right after the Mishnah where it says the Gemara, the big letter is Gimel Mem. And so the order of the events are going to be like this. We're going to learn the Gemara here to the end of the page because we're going to finish that today. That's the plan, which is going to include number one, a few halachas and customs, two specifically actually, related to the Mishnah. Then it's going to be a discussion on whether someone who is blind is obligated in the recitation of the Haggadah. That's going to be that discussion. And then that's the discussion to the end of this page here. From there, we're going to go to the Code of Jewish Law and the Rebbe's commentary on the Haggadah related to this section of the Haggadah that we're learning now. And then the Gemara is going to go back to the Gemara, where the Gemara is going to have a whole lengthy discussion on the correct text and phrasing of Hallel. And there's going to be some commentary around Hallel and Tehillim for quite a bit. And then the Gemara is going to get back to the Seder. Okay, so what did we learn in our Mishnah? The Mishnah gave us the closing text of the Haggadah. Right? The previous Mishnah before this one, told us how to open the Haggadah. And we opened up the Haggadah after invoking curiosities from the child. The actual Haggadah opens up with the child asking the questions. That was the last Mishnah. And then the Gemara there told us how to respond to the child's question. Right? So we had a few different laws regarding that. Responding to the child's question in number one, on the level that the kid can understand. Number two, you're supposed to have the storyline that begins in a place of shame and then concludes with glory. Right? And then we had the Mishnah told us to elaborate on the verses that the person would say when he would bring the Bikurim, Arami Avadavi. And now this Mishnah gives us the closing of the Haggadah. And the closing of the Haggadah is, Rabbi Levi said, you have to cover three topics. You must discuss the Pesach, you must discuss the Matzah, and you must discuss the Maror. And explain what each of them means. And if you didn't do that, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. We learned a discussion about which obligation Rabbi Gamliel is referring to. And the main opinion, majority opinion, as is quoted in the Rebbe's Haggadah, is that if you don't discuss the Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, you haven't fulfilled your obligation of telling the story. Right? So it's another element of the telling of the story. That was the first half of the Mishnah. And the second half of the Mishnah was the transition from there into the Hallel. Right? Which is, every generation we're supposed to re-experience the Exodus. We spoke about that at great length. And therefore, we have to praise and thank you and so on. Blessed are you, God our Lord, who is the Redeemer of Israel. And then from there, we go into the Hallel. That's the order of the Haggadah. We stop in the middle of Hallel for eating the Matzah Maror meal, and we continue the Hallel after and finish benching. So that's our Mishnah here. Our Mishnah is the closing of the Haggadah, the recapping of the story in its basic three elements, the Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, and then the transition from there into Hallel, which includes this paragraph acknowledging the grandeur of the Exodus in that it continues in every generation, and therefore we have to praise you, and therefore we go on to say Hallel. That's the order of, that's the Mishnah at present. So the Gemara first is going to comment, as I mentioned. The Gemara is first going to comment on the way in which we recite Rabbi Gamliel's teaching, which is to make mention of the Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. Then the Gemara is going to discuss, as a spin-off for a conversation, whether or not a blind person is obligated in the recitation of the Haggadah. So this is what we're going to do today. So Gemara, Amar Rava says, Sarach sheyaymar, one is obligated to say, Vaitzanu haiti misha. One is obligated to include in the text of the Haggadah this verse which says, and us you took us out from there. Right? The Rebbe discussed this comment from Rava, and the Rebbe argued that this comment from Rava, that we are to include in our recitation of the Haggadah, in addition to the verse quoted in the Mishnah, which says, and you shall tell your son on that day, because of this, that God took me out of Egypt. In addition, Rava says, you also have to include the verse which says, and us you took out of there. This, the Rebbe said, is the proof that you don't only feel as if you left Egypt, but you have to demonstrate it. Because when you say we, you're talking about all of us. So you see me, I see you, and we together demonstrate to each other our freedom. Yes? Remember this? Yeah? Okay. Rava says further, matzah, this is the halacha. When we get to the Alter Shulchan Aruch and his commentary, we're going to see the specific Chabad custom and the various customs about this. But Rava says, matzah, when you, as per Rabbi Gamliel's instruction, describe what the meaning of matzah is all about, sarach lagbia, you should raise the matzah. We're going to see the Chabad custom. We just put our hand on it. But the way Rava puts it is you're supposed to pick up the matzah. And in many communities, that's what they do. They literally lift up the matzah. So matzah tzarich lagbia. The matzah must be raised when the person describes, or one should pick it up when he describes what matzah is all about.
And not just point to it.
Some people point, some people raise it. Chabad custom is to touch it, as we'll see. We'll get to the Alter Rebbe's code and the Rebbe's Haggadah, and we'll see more details. But this is the way Rebbe phrased it. You got to lift it up.
When it's in the challah bag, when it's in the matzah bag?
We're going to see different customs about it, yeah. So you have to raise the matzah. Marar, when you describe the meaning of marar, as per Rabbi Gamliel's instruction, sarach lagbia, you also have to raise the marar, or point or touch, as per the various customs. But the basar, the meat that you have sitting on your seder plate, which is there to remember the Pesach offering, we use the shank bone or the neck of a chicken, depending on your custom. But that meat ain't tzarich lagbia. You don't need to raise it when you describe what the Pesach offering is about. Continues Rav Levi, not only that, not only do you not need to raise it, but actually you shouldn't raise it. Why? There's a prohibition, a very serious prohibition of eating any sacrificial food outside of the parameters and place where that food is supposed to be eaten. Every morning, after we put on our tefillin, we read the Mishnahs of Ezehu Mokaiman. Right? Literally translate the words Ezehu Mokaiman. Where Ezehu is where, Ezehu which is, Mokaiman the places, Shel Zavachim of their offerings. What's the proper place? And the Mishnah goes on to describe each set of karbanis where in the temple it's supposed to be offered, where the slaughtering takes place, and then it also describes where it's eaten and who it eats it. Right? And every carbon has its parameters of where it's supposed to be eaten and who's supposed to eat it. Until when it's supposed to be eaten, right? The parameters of when, where, and who eats which carbon. So there's a serious prohibition against eating these sacrificial foods outside of that designated area. And this includes the Pesach offering, which has to be eaten in Jerusalem. Right? How's it go? And it's eaten in the whole city. Right? That's where the Pesach offering is eaten. Where's the siddur?
Yeah, and it's registered and eaten at midnight.
That's right. So, but the point here is it's got to be eaten in the city of Jerusalem.
Yeah. Well,
so it's a serious prohibition.
The lesser holy sacrifices have to be eaten within Jerusalem.
That's right. That's and the Pesach offering is kachim kalim.
Yeah.
So eating Pesach offering outside of Jerusalem proper is a serious prohibition. And therefore we refrain from doing anything that will make it look like we are doing that. Which is why, as we learned, we don't eat the shank bone. Because it would look like we're eating a Pesach offering. We don't even roast anything. Right? We have a custom not even to eat any roast meat on the Seder night. So it shouldn't look like we're eating a Pesach offering. So likewise, says Rava, this is why you should not pick up your meat when you describe the Pesach as you did when you described the matzah and as you did when you described the maror. So it shouldn't appear as if you're eating the Pesach offering outside of Jerusalem because you're sitting here in Babylonia or Canada. Follow?
Okay.
Yeah, what do you say?
No, just a question, I guess. Is buy roasted food. I mean, how else do you cook things? You can't, what, do you fry?
Cook. Roast in halacha means without any liquid. Putting in a pot roast that we call roast is not called roasting because we have sauces and juices in there.
Right.
Roasting in halacha, tzli means direct contact with heat without any juices or liquid.
Like grilling then.
Yes, grilling would be the right way.
Pesach, it's super strict. Even you can't even use a metal skewer.
That's right, because the metal skewer
Because
will make
it-
juices. The
inside
juices would heat
that's
up inside. It would heat up the juices and which would recook the
steam,
food. That's correct.
of
Use
it
a wood
and
spit
Yeah.
and a dry wood, a certain kind of wood. That's right. That's correct.
Mm.
This is correct.
Mm.
Okay, all to say that we avoid anything that gives the appearance of looking like we're engaging in actual Pesach offering, and therefore do not lift up that meat. As Rashbam puts it, it's not that it looks like you're eating it because you're just picking it up, but it looks like you're at least sanctifying it, which also you cannot do. You cannot sanctify the Pesach offering today. And therefore, whereas the matzah you can lift it up as you describe the matzah, the maror you can lift up as you describe the matzah, as you describe the maror. Don't do so with the Pesach offering. Discussion 1, which again, this will be relevant in halacha, which we'll see God willing tomorrow. There are a couple of halachas from this mission and the last mission that we didn't cover, which I want to do, not tomorrow, Monday, I'm sorry. Now comes the next discussion, which is a blind person obligated in the recitation of the Haggadah? Well, why shouldn't they be? Says the Gemara. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Rav Acha, son of Yaakov, said there's 3 lines under the big Gimel Mem. Right? Under the word Gemara, 3 lines down. In the middle, it says Amar Rav Acha. Amar Acha, Rav Acha said, Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Rav Acha, son of Yaakov, says, Summa, a blind person, Pater Melemar Haggadah, is exempt from reciting the Haggadah. It's not the halacha, but it's still he says so. How does he derive from this? Where does he derive this from? Because Ksiv Hacha, it says here, with respect to the night of the Seder, with respect to Ve'gadat Labincha, with respect to telling your child a story, it's the verse we quoted in the Mishnah, which is, tell your child on that day, because of this, that God did for me. Ksiv Hacha bavor zeh, it says because of this. Whenever you say the word this, the indication is, at least that's where we're understanding it now, is you have the ability to be able to point at something and say this, as opposed to that. That is not something that's in the present. Zeh is something that's in the present. Is this. So if I say this, it means I'm capable of looking at that thing, pointing at it, and saying, this is what I'm talking about. If one is blind, one cannot do that. Now, where does he derive this from? Ksiv Hasam. It says there, elsewhere, with respect to the rebellious child, where the parents come to the court and they say, B'neinu zeh, this child of ours is misbehaving, and they go through the whole procedure of the rebellious child, the ben soder to moda. So malahalan, just as there, with respect to the rebellious child, because the verse said that the parents come to court and they say, B'neinu zeh, this child of ours, our sages derive prat l'suma, to the exclusion of a blind person. Because blind parents cannot say, this child, they can't point at the kid, they don't see him. It's the halacha.
Is that a good there shovel?
So it's kind of a gzer shav, not exactly as we'll see. That's why I'm not phrasing it as gzer shav exactly. I'm phrasing it more as derived from the way we understand it there to understand it here also, because the Gemara is going to separate in a moment the two, and why it's wrong to apply the standard of that to here, as we'll see. But it's kind of like a gzer shava, in which we're looking at the way the sages understand the word "this child of ours" to exclude the blind. So afkan, so to here, where it says, because of this that God did for me, pavor zeh, prat l'sumin, we exclude blind people. End quote from Rav Acha, son of Yaakov. The Gemara says, Eini, is this the case? Blind people indeed exempt? The Omar Mereimar said, Shaltinu l'Rabbanan, I asked the sages, to Beit Rav Yosef, who studied in the house of Rabbi Yosef. They studied by Rabbi Yosef's study hall. Rabbi Yosef was blind. So I asked the students, Man to Amar Haggadah Beit Rav Yosef, who is the one that would read the Haggadah at the house of Rabbi Yosef, in Rabbi Yosef's study hall? People would go to study at their sages. They would go for a year or two and spend everything there. Pesach, Yom Tov, everything. So Rabbi Yosef has a seder in his study hall.
Yeah.
And as we learned, the real way is one person says it and responds and everybody else is listening. So who is the leader of the Haggadah there? He's asking this because Rabbi Yosef was blind. So Amru, they told him.
Perfect case on point.
Sorry?
Good case.
Exactly. Amru, they told him, Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef led the Haggadah. Even though, just finished saying he was blind. Furthermore, same thing happened. Man da Omar Haggadah Beit Rav Sheshes. The same question was posed to the students of Rabbi Sheshes, who was also blind. Rabbi Sheshes was also blind. So they asked him. So this Mereimar inquired of the students of Rav Sheshes, who said the Haggadah at Rav Sheshes's Seder. Amru, the student said, Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes did it.
Not really proof. Maybe they could, but they're not up.
Ah, that's a good point. I was hoping you would ask that. But why is that still a proof? Because one who is not obligated in a mitzvah cannot help fulfill the obligation of someone who is. So, for example, a child cannot recite the benching out loud, me say amen, and I will fulfill the obligation. Because the child's obligation to say the benching is only rabbinic because of education. My obligation is biblical. So I cannot answer amen to his bracha and fulfill my obligation. We have to be of equal obligatory standard to fulfill each other's obligation. We learned this with respect to Kiddush and Havdalah. Women versus men.
Kiddush is not really.
Because she might be biblical for her too, right? So as long as the two people are of equal obligation, then one can fulfill the other person's obligation. Rav Sheshes and Rav Yosef, if they are exempt from the Haggadah, even though they may recite it, but they could not do it on behalf of their students who are biblically obligated, if they are exempt. So the fact that they led the Haggadah indicates that they're of the view that
You're obligated.
they're obligated. The Gemara says, well, here's the reason. Kasavri Rabbanan, these sages, Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes, are of the view that matzah bezman hazeh, matzah nowadays, the Rabbanan is rabbinic. And because matzah today is rabbinic, therefore the whole idea of being able to say, because of this matzah, and required to see, which is a biblical injunction, is not relevant today because it's rabbinic. Again, we don't rule this way because we, of course, already know that matzah is biblical today. But the Gemara is proposing that perhaps Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes, who led the Seder even though they were blind, is because they were of the view that matzah is rabbinic. And therefore the whole injunction of this verse, which says, because of this, then you're pointing at the matzah and you can see it, is not relevant. And therefore they could do the Haggadah anyway, even though they're lacking the pointing ability.
It's not a proof then.
And therefore it's not a proof for
Whether it's obligated or not.
well, it is, but their opinion that says that the blind is allowed to say the Haggadah is contingent on the fact that matzah is biblical, rabbinic. But in the time when matzah was biblical, and if you are obligated to point and say this, the blind would be exempt. Clear? Clear on that or no?
Yeah.
Yeah? So says the Gemara, therefore, Machlal, if that's the case, then we would have to conclude that Rav Acha bar Yaakov, who said the blind are exempt, Savar, he is of the view, matzah is mana zedaraisa. And today, matzah is biblical. And because matzah is biblical, and the Torah says you have to be able to say bavor zeh because of this, means you can't be blind. Yeah? So in other words, if Rav Acha bar Yaakov says the blind is exempt, it's because matzah is biblical, and therefore you're required to be able to point at it. Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes, who were blind and recited the Haggadah, is because they're of the opinion that matzah is rabbinic, and therefore you're not obligated to point at it. Clear? Which the Gemara challenges, but Rav Acha bar Yaakov, who the Omar matzah is mana zedarabanan. Rav Acha bar Yaakov is the poster person for the one who does say matzah is rabbinic nowadays, which would mean he should allow the blind to be saying it. He shouldn't exempt them. Says the Gemara, no. Kasavar, Rav Acha is of the view, even though matzah is rabbinic, called a tikkun, rabbanon ke'in deraisa tikkun. There is this principle that whenever the sages enact a behavior that's in relation to fulfilling a no longer existent biblical obligation, they will enact it in such a way that it mirrors the way it would have been done biblically, even though it's rabbinic. Sometimes rabbinic enactments are standalone. Hanukkah is a standalone rabbinic enactment. Purim is a standalone rabbinic enactment. Sometimes rabbinic enactments are, say, a guardrail, muktzah, so you don't come to carry or whatever the prohibitions are. But sometimes, in this case, let's say Marar, for example,
Gzeras.
it's not right, Gzeras, but Marar is not a Gzera. Marar is, we no longer have biblical Marar. We don't want to lose that mitzvah. Okay, so we're going to obligate you to eat Marar. So we're obligating you to eat Marar because you don't have it. The sages are obligating to maintain a biblical mitzvah that doesn't exist anymore.
At least not for the time being.
Not until the temple returns. Therefore,
We want to have preservation.
yep. So in such a case, the rule is
Biblical nature.
that when the sages enact such a mitzvah, they do it in such a way that it maintains all the biblical trimmings. So therefore, even though in Rav Acha's view, matzah nowadays is rabbinic, nonetheless, they're going to maintain the biblical injunction that you have to be able to see the matzah when you say the Haggadah. And thus, even though it's rabbinic, the blind are still exempt. Yeah, this is how the Gemara understands Rav Acha's position. The Gemara goes back. Now, let Rav Sheshes and Rav Yosef. Rav Sheshes and Rav Yosef, who were blind, who did recite the Haggadah, so clearly they're not saying that the matzah is biblical, because if matzah is biblical, you have to be able to point at it and you cannot be blind. So which means they say it's rabbinic, but they say it's rabbinic in such a way that it's not the same as biblical, because they're blind and they're doing it. Follow that?
But if you hold it, you can still be blind.
So how does that work? Let's understand where we're going. We built something up. Okay. The Torah says
to do it.
Well, let's go step by step so we see how we got there. Okay. The Torah says, you tell your child in that day, because of this that God did to me. This because of this means I can physically see what I'm looking at and I can point at it and say this. That excludes blind people. Okay. That's only true if what you're pointing at is a biblical commandment. Then the biblical injunction to point at this is relevant. If it's rabbinic, then that biblical injunction doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
Okay. That's Rav Yosef and Rav Shesh's view as to why blind people can recite the Haggadah.
That's why Yosef.
That's why Yosef and Rav Sheshes recited the Haggadah even though they were blind. Okay. Rav Acha agrees that matzah is rabbinic, and yet still prohibits the blind people from saying it, or at least exempts them. Which means he says the matzah is rabbinic, and yet at the same time still maintains that biblical injunction which says you have to be able to point at it and say this. Why? Because rabbinic mitzvah, in his opinion, maintains the trimmings of the biblical mitzvah. Now, Rav Sheshes and Rav Yosef therefore are saying the rabbinic mitzvah does not maintain the biblical trimmings. What's going on? This the Gemara asks, but Sheshes and Rav Yosef, Nami Abad, they call it Tikkun Rabbanan Kin Daraisa Tikkun. Is it not of Sheshes and Rav Yosef's view also that when the sages enact a mitzvah to replace the biblical mitzvah, they maintain all the biblical trimmings? Is that not the case? Is that not the case? So the Gemara therefore scratches this whole thing and says, forget it. Everybody agrees matzah is biblical. It's biblical nowadays. Or Rav Acha doesn't. Rav Acha says it's rabbinic, but still maintains the prohibition of this. Okay. Rav Acha and Rav Sheshes and Rav Yosef, no. They're like, matzah is biblical. Now, how come the blind are saying that God, if it's biblical? And the Torah says, because of this that God did to me, you have to point at it and look at it, and they're blind. So explains the Gemara, because they reject the entire comparison of the pointing of this to the case of the rebellious child where the parents have to say because of this. They reject that comparison. Right? The original prototype of a verse that uses the word this to indicate no blind people is the rebellious child. Where the Torah says the parents come to the court and they say, this child of ours. So our sages say, if the parents are saying this child of ours, they must be able to see the child. No blind people. Yeah, if that's the case. Why don't they apply the same standard to the words because of this by the Seder? Why are they rejecting the comparison? Explains the Gemara. Hachi hashta. Is this what you're thinking? We cannot compare the Seder night where it says because of this to the rebellious child where it says because this child of ours. Because Bishlei Mahasam, over there, in the case of the rebellious child, the reason why we derive from the words Benenu said this child of ours to exclude the blind, agree with me?
Yeah.
Is midahavale lemichta benenuhu, because there's an alternative that the verse could have used. The verse could have said that child of ours. And because it could have said that child of ours, and it chose to say this child of ours, we say excluding, we say that the verse is changing its language to teach us to exclude the blind.
What's the difference between this and that?
This implies something in my present.
Right.
That could be something not here.
Well, that you could be pointing there. That
It could be, doesn't have to be.
No,
Right?
it's
I could say,
this son of mine, not my other son.
no. Benenu who, or actually not that child. It could have said, Benenu who, he is our child.
Oh, okay.
Which is the same thing as that, because it doesn't have to be in the present. I could say he's my child and him not being here.
Right.
But I'm not going to say this is my kid, referring to my son who's in camp now.
Correct. Yeah.
I will say he's my child.
Right.
Or that child. So because the Torah could have used different phrasing, but chose to use the phrasing which says this child, it's there to teach you only if you can see the child, not if you're blind. So this is the Gemara says, Hassam there with respect to the rebellious child, because the Torah could have said, he is our child, or that is our child. Diksiv, but the Torah chose to write, Benenu zeh, this child of ours. Shmamina, therefore we can derive from that verse, Prat l'sumen, to exclude blind people. And the blind parents cannot make their child go through the whole rebellious child issue. Hudasa is why this verse is changed to teach us this law.
You can't transfer that.
You can't transfer that logic to our mission, to our verse, because hacha ila bavor zeh my lifter. If not for the phrasing because of this, what should have it said? What other phrasing would it have?
Yeah.
It comes on that day, your child is asking you, what are we doing here? And you tell the child, because of this, that God took me out of Egypt. How else should I say it?
Insane.
There's only phrasing.
Right.
And therefore, Ella, what's the verse telling you? It's simply telling you, Bavor matzah and maror, because of the matzah and maror. It's not coming to exclude only someone who can point at it. So they reject the whole derivative to begin with. So the Gemara, in other words, this was the exercise. It's a long exercise, but to make one simple point. The Gemara first wanted to say that we exclude blind people from the recitation of the Haggadah because the Torah says the word this. And this means you can look at it and point at it. Yeah. The Gemara wanted to maintain that reading, and yet there are two blind sages who did recite the Haggadah for everybody. How do we try to maintain that? By explaining, well, it's rabbinic nowadays, and because the mitzvahs, because matzah is rabbinic, therefore the pointing this doesn't apply anymore. To which the Gemara said, well, hold on a second. When you make a rabbinic enactment to replace a biblical one, you try to maintain all the biblical trimmings, and therefore it should apply. And if the Gemara says, we must therefore conclude that Rav Sheshes and Rav Yosef, who were blind and recited the Haggadah for their crowd, must have rejected the whole idea of excluding the blind. And that this reading, because of this, is nothing to do with excluding blind, but because that's the only way to explain we're talking about this stuff in front of us, even if you can't see it. There's no other way to say it. With respect to the verse that says, by the rebellious child, this is this child of ours, and therefore our sages derive this child, not a blind person. Well, that's because the Torah had other options for phrasing. It could have said, he is our child. It says this to exclude the blind. That's why I'm saying it's not really Mamash Gezerah Shava exactly. Yeah. Okay, this ends the discussion of whether blind people are obligated, and the conclusion is, yes, they are. As per Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes, the blind are indeed obligated. But we did learn is the halacha of lifting up the matzah and maror when you recite and describe the matzah and maror. We'll get to the Shulchan Aruch about that halacha and some other halachas that we missed out from the last two mishnahs with respect to the recitation of the Haggadah. We're going to look at those halachas and Rabbi's Haggadah, God willing, next week. Right. A wonderful day and a good Shabbos.
Punishing these families